Welcome to today's lecture. Today we're going to talk about the history of medical cannabis throughout the ages. Cannabis has been described as one of the oldest cultivated plants on the face of the earth. In fact, there is probably no other medicinal application that has been recorded as long as cannabis. There is evidence for the medicinal applications of cannabis for a wide array of different types of health conditions that remain currently perplexing based on conventional understanding and our conventional applications of medications. The oldest known recorded use of cannabis dates back to over 6,000 years BC, when in China cannabis was used as a nutritional product, essentially as a food. Likewise, about 4000 BC, there's evidence that cannabis was extensively used as a textile. So essentially, most of the clothing that people were wearing in China at that time was made out of cannabis. In the year 2727 BC is the first recorded medicinal use of cannabis in the Chinese pharmacopoeia. Likewise, cannabis was extensively reported by Chinese emperors as having medicinal applications and value. In the year 1450 BC, the book of Exodus describes holy anointed oil made out of the hemp plant. In the year 1213 BC, Egyptians recorded the medicinal application of cannabis for treating glaucoma, nausea, and inflammation. Cannabis was also used extensively as an analgesic. Now, it is important to keep in mind that cannabis has a history of a nomenclature that has largely directed how people think about the plant. So, back in the 1700s, Jean Lamarck actually coined the phrase of cannabis indica strains versus cannabis sativa strains. And essentially, he was making these descriptions largely based on their morphological characteristics. Later, other researchers also described a third category that they refer to as cannabis ruderalis. And this is essentially the closest variant that we would describe as a modern day hemp plant. One of the problems of this categorization system is that it really doesn't take into consideration all the different phytocomponents or compounds and molecules that are found within the plant itself. So just by taking a morphological assessment and essentially describing the shape of the plant and particularly the shape of the leaves, it really doesn't tell you too much about what is actually in the plant. So in theory, a cannabis indica plant is supposed to be one that is shorter and stockier and really bushy, with essentially fatter, shorter leaves. And you could contrast that with what people refer to as a cannabis sativa strain, which is usually described as a much taller plant, more lanky, with leaves that are usually longer and narrow. And again, we could contrast both of those with a hemp plant, at least using this nomenclature. But the fact is that these types of categories are really looked down upon by the scientific community. So I can't tell you how many times I've described cannabis in this fashion only to get reviewers that criticize this description, basically claiming that it doesn't have a scientific merit. And while I agree largely with a lot of those points, I still appreciate that the average consumer bases much of their decision making on these descriptions of whether or not a plant is described as an indica or a sativa. So it's still a fundamental characteristic that the modern day consumer is using. So in that sense, it has absolute relevance for the understanding the effects of cannabis. So what researchers have agreed on is the relative origin of the first cultivated cannabis plant strains. And they have essentially pin-marked Central Asia as the birthplace in which humans began to cultivate the cannabis plant. Still, many researchers would contend that there is no truly wild strains of cannabis left on Earth. That is that basically humans have been tinkering with the plant for such a long time that all plants are essentially hybrids, and all plants have essentially been touched through the mechanics of human farmers. And you could just think about, again, how far back there is a recorded history of cannabis use. So we could go back to ancient Egypt at around 1700 BC, and you will find extensive descriptions of how to actually apply cannabis-based concoctions and formulas. So with absolute precision, it's quite amazing. Likewise, I can't overemphasize how important cannabis has been throughout human history, particularly with regard to entire industries. So, for example, naval operations, and essentially the ability to sail around the world has historically been almost exclusively dependent on the use of the hemp plant or the cannabis plant for making ropes and sails and many of the basic equipment that is needed to be able to sail on the sea. So cannabis has been an incredibly vital plant throughout human history for some of these basic purposes. And in fact, humans have essentially created wars over the ability to control such a valuable natural resource. Now, at the same time of all the different applications that have been recorded throughout ancient human history, there has also been the recording of the prohibition of cannabis. So it's interesting. It really does appear as though cannabis has been introduced and reintroduced and prohibited from human use many times throughout human history. And that only goes to show how powerful of a plant this is in terms of its actual resource potential. So for example, back in 1378, the Emir of the Ottoman Empire makes the first edict against the eating or smoking of cannabis. So essentially this was the first war on drugs. Around the year 1798, Napoleon declared a total prohibition on the use of marijuana after realizing that much of the Egyptian lower class, apparently, were habitual smokers. So Napoleon essentially prohibited the use of cannabis because so many folks were essentially using it. So you can imagine the ability to control people by controlling a resource that, at least at the time, many humans were dependent on. In 1868, Egypt became the first modern country to outlaw cannabis ingestion. And likewise, in 1890, hashish was made illegal in Turkey. So again, cannabis has been prohibited from use, used as a tool to control populations, utilized in such a valuable way that it was the basis for many industries, only to be prohibited from use by many powerful folks and reintroduced into societies over and over again. If we were to move a little bit forward, just to talk about a brief history of the application of cannabis and hemp throughout North America. There is an extensive history of colonial Americans utilizing hemp for many different purposes. So of course we know that hemp has been used as a raw material for making textiles way back as far as ancient Egypt. But this was also extensively used throughout some of America's early years as a textile. So for example, we could just go back to the very quote of Thomas Jefferson himself when he said that hemp is of the first necessity to the wealth and the protection of the country. Now, the actual origins of hemp in the United States is somewhat debatable. But at least in terms of the 1913 yearbook of the United States Department of Agriculture, there is the claim that industrial hemp came over with the British to New England and spread thereafter. Other scholars have suggested that hemp was introduced to North America in the 1600s by the Puritans, in which case they used hemp to make ropes, sails, clothing, and utilized it as a common ingredient in many different types of medicines, which were sold openly in pharmacies even at that time. A major turning block in the history of cannabis use in North America resulted from the passing of the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, which essentially created punitive consequences for violating the act, which required essentially extensive taxes to be able to cultivate and to transfer cannabis. So it essentially created an atmosphere whereby the average farmer was not able to afford the ability to engage in the cannabis or hemp industry. Now, this act was later found to be unconstitutional, but cannabis prohibition essentially took on a life of its own. It is important to note that throughout much of modern American history, at least going back nearly 100 years, cannabis has almost exclusively been illicit. It's been illegal to be able to cultivate and to utilize for any application, regardless of your role as a patient or a medical provider or a scientist. It's essentially been off limits for almost 100 years now, effectively. And there's been many folks that have experienced the consequences of that. So here's just a couple individuals that were some of the first maybe victims of cannabis prohibition laws, breaking the rules back then and facing the fines and consequences. Despite cannabis's prohibition and the historic forces that have been sustaining a state of prohibition, cannabis remained listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia from 1850 to 1941. In fact, marijuana and hashish extracts were the first, second, or third most prescribed medications in the United States from 1842 to the 1890s, if you could wrap your mind around that. So it was prohibited, even though it was one of the most important medications that the medical industry was utilizing just about up until that time. So for example, in 1851, the United States Dispensary reported that the extract of hemp is a powerful narcotic, here meaning a sleep-producing drug, one that caused exhilaration, intoxication, delirious hallucinations, and in subsequent action, drowsiness and stupor, with little effect upon the circulation. It is asserted almost to act as a decided aphrodisiac, to increase the appetite, and occasionally to induce a cataleptic state. And in morbid states, and this is particularly important, cannabis is shown to have many of the analgesic effects of opiates, for example, but without the gastric intestinal disruptions. So that is really important, particularly for a health condition that is perpetual, that is chronic pain. Likewise, the list of pre-prohibition medical applications of cannabis is extensive. It includes, for example, gout, rheumatism, hydrophobia, convulsions, hysteria, mental depression, insanity. And yet, despite all these medical applications and formal usage of the cannabis plant, it has been successfully prohibited. So one could think about, the degree of social engineering that had to take place to convince the average consumer or medical provider or educated scientist that something that was once utilized as a foundation for health provisioning is essentially dangerous. Okay, so you had to reverse the human experience and also the history of the medical applications of cannabis. But that was effectively done. So after multiple generations of really concerted efforts, essentially these efforts did eventually pay off, and much of the population, as at certain times throughout history, viewed cannabis as a negative aspect of our society. Currently, the most challenging aspect of conducting medical cannabis research or even having access to cannabis for patients is the 1970s Controlled Substances Act, which essentially scheduled cannabis as an illicit substance among the category of other substances that are deemed to have no medicinal potential and are also deemed to have a high risk of dependence and harm. So ever since the 1970s, which really formalized cannabis as one of the most dangerous substances on earth, cannabis research has been effectively locked down, and the ability for health providers to be able to direct patients in cannabis therapies has been unavailable. Likewise, needless to say, cannabis has been largely illicit for patients to be able to utilize since the 1970s and even prior to that, obviously, starting off with the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act. Now, since the 1970 Controlled Substances Act, society has been chipping away at the assumption that cannabis actually meets the criteria of a Scheduled I substance. Again, one that is deemed to have no medicinal potential and is also thought to be extremely dangerous and have a high potential for negative consequences, including addiction. Scientists have also created synthetic versions of naturally occurring cannabinoids. And, maybe as far back as 1986 or so, some of those medications were rescheduled so that they could be utilized for research and for medicinal purposes. But the big change really came in the year 2003 when Canada became the first country to actually provide cannabis to medical patients. Since that time, many different types of programs have enacted state-authorized medical cannabis programs here in the United States. Some of these states obviously now have an allowance for recreational cannabis use. However, the most profound change in the history of cannabis reformation laws has come relatively recently, and it is essentially piggybacking on the Farm Bill of 2014, which essentially designated what society is now calling a hemp plant as those plant strains which contain less than 0.3% tetrahydrocannabinol or THC levels, according to dry weight. So according to this Farm Act of 2014, essentially hemp became available for industrial usage. It also allowed agricultural pilot projects to study the growth, cultivation, or marketing of industrial hemp. So essentially, we have a modern enactment of a mechanism that is one defining hemp as qualitatively distinct from other forms of cannabis, again based on that THC level, but also provisioning the usage of hemp for different types of industrial purposes as well as for general educational and research opportunities. And I mentioned that the most profound changes in cannabis reformation laws, at least in my opinion, have come relatively recently, and specifically in the year 2018. So this was the year when the FDA actually approved a cannabis-based medication called Epidiolex. So this medication is based on high concentrations of cannabidiol or CBD levels. Now, well, that is interesting. Actually, those medications are quite expensive. So there's been estimates that the annual cost of engaging in those types of medications for its prescribed usage can run, tens of thousands of dollars every year. But I think even more importantly, by leaps and bounds, is what actually also occurred in the year 2018, which was not only the expiration of the 2014 Farm Bill, but the extension of it and the actual signing by President Donald Trump of essentially what they call the 2018 Farm Bill, which descheduled cannabis plants with less than 0.3% tetrahydrocannabinol or THC levels. So this was a remarkable change in the history of cannabis because essentially patients after that point had the opportunity to grow the cannabis plant themselves federally, legally. Okay, so that is a profound change in the accessibility of cannabis for the average individual in the United States. Now, there are many different types of caveats with regard to state level regulations of the ability to cultivate, to purchase, and to be able to sell hemp-based products for any type of purpose in different states and different regions throughout the country. However, for example, here in New Mexico, it is completely legal at the federal and the state level to be able to do all of that. So the average citizen here in New Mexico can plant a hemp plant, can utilize the hemp plant for different types of purposes completely legal. So that is why I believe that the 2018 Hemp Farm Bill was the greatest, at least modern day, change in cannabis reformation laws, and one that has real practical benefits and applications for the average citizen. Now, what is the difference between, for example, a flower or a bud that's produced by a hemp plant with less than 0.3% THC versus a non-hemp plant that has greater than 0.3% THC? Well, you're going to have to actually use some machine to detect the differences, because they oftentimes will look very similar. Okay, so this is interesting as well because it does have consequences with regard to individual civil rights and the ability for law enforcement essentially to be able to detect the types of cannabis strains or variants that are legal and the ones that are illegal still, federally speaking. So they actually look the same. So a law enforcement officer cannot just simply, make that determination by looking at the plant. And that probably has its own consequences in terms of the types of criminality that's taking place, or perhaps even the ability for patients to cultivate different types of strains illegally with the low risk of detection. But regardless of whether individuals are using cannabis with higher levels of THC or cannabis with lower levels of THC, we know that the plant has remarkable potential, not only therapeutically, but also in terms of its industrial applications. So throughout history, all aspects of the structure and the morphology of the plant have been utilized for different purposes, from the leaves to the stalks to the seeds to the flowers. So for example, historically, cannabis-based stalks have been used as a biofuel, used to make ethanol, paper products, and cardboard. The base fiber of the plant in and of itself, as I mentioned, has been extensively used for naval operations and all the logistical materials that are necessary to be able to sail on the seas, including the sails themselves and all the rope. Likewise, base fiber has also been extensively used throughout history as a fabric for textiles, different types of clothing, and for carpet. In terms of modern day hemp products, at least here in New Mexico, there's many shops around town, and they'll sell everything from different types of topical agents to concentrates to even the actual flower in and of itself. As I mentioned, here in New Mexico, one can legally smoke the hemp flowers, I believe openly. I'm not sure about that, so don't hold me to it. But it is quite interesting, and certainly the times are changing, and these laws are rapidly evolving. It's going to be quite interesting to see what type of changes this year is going to bring.